I'd like to imagine myself at the Southeast Railway portal at London Bridge on the 29th of June, 1848. It's 5:20 a.m. It's drizzling. The last carriages have just left the balls at the end of the London season. And I don't know why I'm there, perhaps to receive the Daily Express from France, which is about to arrive with news of what happens after the assassination of the Archbishop and everything that had happened during the last 3 days. Europe was in a state of revolution, and I'm looking for news to transport to the daily papers, which get it out by the middle of the day. Amazing modern times have arrived. To my astonishment, 230 clerics start to gather on the platform, all in their white lawn sleeves, and board a train, a specially hired train by Alexander Beresford Hope, the member for Maidstone, 28 years old, to be taken to Canterbury for the opening of the first new collegiate institution in British life for some hundreds of years. This is St. Augustine's College in Canterbury. The London Tavern has packed 1,250 lunches to go on the train, which will be served in the crypt and in the courtyard. Various people, many of them later connected to Keble College, from the peerage and the higher ranks of professional life in London, follow on a subsequent regular express. Something that couldn't have been done 4 years before. You couldn't have made it down to Canterbury and got back in one day, even 4 years beforehand. Again, modern times. And they're going to what is essentially a modern institution. This is St. Augustine's, built on the remnants and what William Butterfield has dug up as evidence of the original medieval abbey. And using its basic footprint, he's established a college for missionaries of 50 students and 6 fellows and a warden. He's constructed a library above one of the few surviving remnants, which turns into a crypt, which will eventually be a museum of the colonial world. And he's built a vast and capacious and very high-roofed library, much admired, and a range 265 feet long, one continuous roof ridge of the quarters for the students. There is another building for the fellows. There is a little chapel, and the medieval dining hall, which was some good evidence of it still standing, has been reconstructed in Butterfield in terms. The long cloister below, off which lead the classrooms and other facilities, raised and allowing students to walk and converse and so on. And a critical factor for future reference, in this roof, below the roof, is a very high-ceilinged corridor, or called a medieval gallery, onto which each of the student room sets, each of them are 15 by 8 feet, open to relieve the stress, be able to walk, to work out a problem, and to meet one another. And it's a communal space in every possible sense. Compared to an Oxford College at the time, which would have been a higgledy-piggledy mass of breweries and sheds and bits of the old and little bits of the new, and so on and so forth. This is an incredibly logical, modern college. And it's much admired and praised for what is phrased, a term we wouldn't come to associate with William Butterfield, for his customary extreme simplicity. That gathering is held. There is a large toast and a generous toast to the architect, who cannot be found. He was of an ascetic, brooding nature, preferred to walk round the gardens with his friend William Webb, not William Webb, John Mason Neal, planning what the next steps in this enterprise were going to be. The moving lights, John Taylor Coleridge, Sir William Heathcote, names come up again 20 years later. You will then find a lot of these people, leading whom was John Keble, who was present on this day, and then went 5 days later north of London on a train to Harrow Weald, to a little college called St Andrew's College, then 2 years old, run by the possibly saintly, possibly malicious, probably insane Edward Munro, who had, as vicar of Harrow Weald, established a model of what a modern English community may look like and how the distress of the poor might be resolved. It was called St Andrew's College. It was designed to train farm boys for possible service to the church as school teachers or as vergers or as whatever there may be. It was condemned immediately as something that dreamed of turning rough ploughboys into sweet choristers. It was, in fact, for quite a while, very successful indeed, though with St Augustine's it became a butt of the jokes and scorn of the anti-High Church party. I bring them up very deliberately to suggest that there is a moment here in the middle 1840s when the urge to reform society, to ameliorate its ills, involves extraordinary experimentation. Experimentation with new colleges, new schools, new ways of doing things. Edward Munro doesn't only establish St Andrew's College, where Butterfield builds an oratory, a library, the dormitories, and schoolrooms. But he also establishes something called the nursery, which is for 15 to 19-year-olds in the country, who can no longer stay at home. The cottagers won't house them. Their parents won't feed them. What happens to them? They become the delinquents of the day, and he establishes what is essentially a collegiate agricultural school where they can learn husbandry more experimentally and more adventurously. I dwell on it a little bit because one of the things that Edward Munro does at that point is to write an open letter to William Ewart Gladstone called Education, Its True Province, the Formation of Character. And that commitment to the formation of character, a formation that includes knowledge, is, I think, the primary impetus behind the great reforms in Victorian education, of which William Butterfield is a part throughout. So he starts in 1845 at Harrow Weald. He began St Augustine's in 1843, and his first parish schools were either in 1841, if you believe me, or 1844 if you follow the wonderful book by Paul Thompson. There are 4 more institutions built by Butterfield after the 2 in Harrow Weald and St Augustine's in the next 3 years alone. The first is the College of the Holy Spirit on the Isle of Cumbray in the Firth of Clyde. Something he starts working on in August 1948, right after these two last events. And an invention of George Boyle, the late Earl of Glasgow, who was 18 years old at the time, had some money, and was of a high church persuasion, and wished to do something. Very uncertain, and it was a institution in constant flux. There were originally 16 places for choristers or schoolboys to learn. There were another 12 to 14 for possible ordinands to study. It never quite took hold. There were various things tried, experiments made as to how to use this institution. It stands pretty much as built by William Butterfield between 1849, when these buildings were first constructed, and 1853, when he had made some alterations. And it's a very, very beautiful ensemble, and you get in this building as well as you do at St. Augustine's, and probably at St. Andrew's, though we have no imagery of it. It was eventually demolished. The same sense of simplicity in the rendering of the buildings, an incredible complexity in the logic that is followed to make the ensemble, to divide the spaces, to make for movement, and so on and so forth, which you begin to see. He did two other institutions that I think of as collegiate. They were condemned as mere nunneries. One is the St. Saviour's home in London, just off Regent's Park, which was a collegial institution for women who wished to serve the poor. And the other one, much more ambitious, for Priscilla Lydia Thelen in Plymouth, St. Dunstan's Abbey. Both developed into religious orders, though originally conceived somewhat more informally, and they both contain school, library, places for young girls to work, basically seamstressing and doing other trades. So we've already got to 4, and there is a 5th one that interests me more than all the others. And this is a modest enterprise for Charles Grafton Holt House, a young cleric who took on the vicarage that the Advasson was in his family of a very obscure and very poor village in Northamptonshire called Hallidon. There was no vicarage. In the first year he lived in a farmhouse and had to borrow a pig cart to get to the station, nearly 15 miles away, to pick up a visitor. And he had this determination, unmarried though not pledged as celibate, but of somewhat poor health. And he bought a little house that was the village butcher's, or there, and then decided to ask Butterfield to add a vicarage that would also be a school for farmers and tradesmen's sons, a boarding school for children, all of course boys, between 8 and 14. There were eventually as many as 36 housed. And he describes his objective very simply in the same terms as the less sober Edward Munro, in saying, I want them young and fresh, but not before 8 years old, nor over 14 when character is formed. But I want them to form within them that manly Christian character, which is the especial fruit of the Church of England, and to do so by combining the regularity and discipline of school with the confidence and affection of home life. And he did something that was perhaps unique for the time, but succeeded for many years. It was still operating in 1881 with success when he died. He mingled everything. So this was the schoolhouse, the school room on top. below facilities to eat, a communal dining hall and preparation of food. The dormitories and the curates and the vicars' quarters were all mixed in together in this building, together with a matron and a small hospital room for the infirm. He was looking at the 8 to 14-year-olds as the salvation of the future. Edward Munro was looking to the 9 to 15-year-olds as a problem to deal with. It raises the fundamental question about the 19th century, I think. What do you do when 50% of the population throughout Butterfield's life is under 22? What do you do when more than a third are between 5 and 14? What do you do when you've despaired of a disorderly society and a corrupt and a vicious one, and feel that the only salvation is in the next generation and not in yours? You build a character, yes, for spiritual reasons, to build the character of the individual, but you're also building, and that's why I call it the schooling of a nation, you're building the characters that will make for an ordered, a disciplined, and affectionate, to use Holthouse's words, society. A community that is structured, manageable, and less threatening. So, briefly to mention that in the next 20 years, before we get to May of 1866, when Butterfield is appointed architect for Keble College, there are colleges by Butterfield in St. Bees Theological College. He does the library and the lecture rooms. There is a home for nurses in training called the St. John's House off the Strand in London. He's contributed the living, dining, chapel, common spaces to nearly all of William John Butler's institutions in the town of Wantage, where Henry Liddon was curate and where the two first came into contact. He's refitted diocesan training colleges for teachers in Lincoln, in Salisbury, and in Battersea. He's built Sir Walter St. John's Grammar School in Battersea. He's built the residential choir school at All Saints Margaret Street. He has perhaps more notoriously intervened at Winchester College and at Merton College, and I now discover he did a lot of work at New College as well. We don't know quite what it is. But Helidon, this example, I think points to one aspect of his career and the career of many architects, and to the life of England and Scotland and Wales, which was that the parish and the parish school was the fundamental vehicle for this transformation of a drunken, disorderly society of the Regency into the well-mannered or better-mannered life of the Victorian age. And Butterfield himself, when asked, why do you devote so much time to the education of farmers who don't need to read and write, he says, because the farm boy of tomorrow is the townsman of, let's beg your pardon, the farm boy of today is the townsman of tomorrow. And if we are to survive, we need townsmen as real citizens and with a spiritual life. So, beginning at Wilmcote in Warwickshire, for the Marquess of Lothian in Jedburgh in Scotland, and most famously, I think at the time, at East Farley in Kent, he establishes a model, and I don't think I'm exaggerating to say this, he establishes the model of the parish school, which others will follow. You'll see it on the left of the church, and there's a school teacher's house, beg your pardon, to this side of it, which he also designed. It was praised again for his extraordinary simplicity And there, I think you can see it has that simplicity. They all follow the same principle throughout the next 40 years of the 42 parish schools he builds. A very high roof for health and for air ventilation. A big open space, divided entry for boys and girls, which is indispensable to Butterfield's sense of propriety, also possibly for safety, and invariably addressing the need, which we know from reading Charlotte Bronte, of how do you get school teacher come? You've got a little hamlet with nothing to accommodate you, so the building of the little school teacher's house becomes a critical factor in this endeavour. And these, again, he follows a similar principle. This one is in Trumpington, near Cambridge, and he colours them accordingly. There may be 2 bedrooms. I've lost my pointer, but you see 2 bedrooms, probably for an unmarried school teacher. This is for 2 pupil assistants who have access to dine in the kitchen. And then there is a little sitting room and 1 bedroom for the school teacher. They may come attached to the schools, or they may come independently. He continues to develop these models. This is my favourite, which is at Poulton, near Keble's father's parish, in Gloucestershire now, but we still claim it for Wiltshire. And you see here extreme simplicity of an absolutely, in my view, an absolutely ravishing quality. It looks at first like it might just be a shed, but this is 24 feet high. So it's a prominent feature in the landscape of the village, and every single element, as with all of Butterfield's work, is developed, including where you put your pen and the inkwell on the desk, and where the school teacher sits. This was for a single schoolmaster. It's a tiny little school. It's meant to accommodate 80 children at best. There is 1 general schoolroom, often divided. You see the division here. Pull the curtain between the boys and the girls. There's, in this case, couldn't afford an entry for the boys and for the girls, but there's 1 yard for the boys and 1 for the girls. And you also have a classroom, which is for the over 12-year-olds. And this is the most conspicuous failure in the scheme. You couldn't afford a 12-year-old to go to school. They were going out into service even until the 1890s. I've read the log of this school, and the teacher can barely get 18 to 19 students in to the school on a good day. On a muddy day, for children with no shoes, they couldn't get there. Until they gravelled a path, they couldn't get there on a dry day. Many times. They couldn't get there during haymaking, not because they were making hay, but because they were taking the food out to the fields, and they were indispensable to the working life of the community. Not until the late 1880s do I find this school establishing itself. One last thing, and we've gone too long, about the need to keep an open space in the school. So the system, Lancasterian system of education, involves a monitor who may bring children up here to work in small groups. But the other thing that happens is you need an open space for the parish festivals, for a harvest festival feast, for a feast on a saint's day, or for everything else. So this is a village hall as well as a school, and they all serve that purpose as well. They change in scale. He never does 2 that look alike. These are almost at identical points in time. That one built of Cotswold stone, this one nearby, but in a different country area. And here he uses flint and stone, and school teachers' house is added on, as happens in many of these instances, to the school as a whole. And here you're looking at a school that accommodates probably 150. In a much more prosperous village. You get them in urban situations as well. This is the wonderful church of St. Cross in a slum area of Manchester that Butterfield completed in 1866, and that the bishop refused to consecrate for 8 years because the name St. Cross sounded too churchy for his taste. And you'll see here an incredibly simple school in which all that Butterfield has done is to rhyme the roof of the tower and the church with the roof of the school. And it makes a wonderful ensemble. This is right after construction, 1866. They couldn't bury the dead in this parish because of the lack of consecration. And the tragic thing to see is that a photograph in 1880, the vast graveyard is already full. This was not a healthy community. 1882 is the last school I know he did, the last parish school, no longer the national school system, but now under the jurisdiction of the parish, who tries to avoid it coming under the board school system, which they're able to do through some quirk in the law. This is the Bath Street School for boys in the enormous St Andrew's parish in Rugby, where the school is designated for 250 boys of the higher grades and has to accommodate 330 within 3 years. In August of the year that the Keble College buildings opened, all St Margaret Street's schools were opened as well. And here what Butterfield does on a tiny, tight little site in the West End of London is basically to stack 4 village schools, one on top of the other, and 4 school teacher houses, one on top on the other side. And he can't use the space in any other way. He has to, all kinds of contortions to allow for boys and girls not to come up the same staircase. So you've got an entrance here on the side alley, and there's a boys' stair, and then you've got this open space in the middle. The best you can do for a schoolyard is this little space between. And it was done, as so many things by William Butterfield were, with a lot of sense of anticipation. So it was built with possible various use of spaces, but basically you've got an infant school, a girls' school, a boys' school, and then something that may have been used and probably was largely used for the working class girls of the community as an evening school or as a workshop. And then you've got a group of 8 teachers, men and women, also carefully divided. Men have their kitchen, women have their kitchen on this side. We may not be too sympathetic to William Butterfield's incredible desire to segregate in this way, but men from women, servants from masters, the family from the service group at Keble College, the servants placed in their own building, very hospitably, with a library, by the way. And this division, this sense of an ordering of society, again, by rank and by behavior. That's the parish school system. I think some of the most wonderful works of William Butterfield are there, and nearly all of them are visible on the ground in villages as you drive through the country, many transformed into village halls. Anticipation is a problem. From 1840 to 1860 is the fastest rate of growth of the population in the 19th century and the most rapid urbanization. But from 1860 to the 1880s, the commercialization, rather than urbanization, begins to then take over. And one of the interesting things about the Margaret Street schools is it was a terrible failure. They couldn't fill it because what had been a squalid and deprived residential area rapidly became an entirely commercial one, and there were no inhabitants left to serve. In contrast to that very, very grand establishment, here is the Pitt School and Chapel, built in 1858 for Keble, in a little hamlet where John Keble had to go to deliver Sunday prayers and a little sermon in a working cottage, and always got ill. And so Charlotte Young contributed £800 from the proceeds from the heir of Redcliffe to build. £800 did the whole thing, a small house for a school teacher, and something that could serve as both a little school and a Sunday chapel, and could also have evening prayers if one of the clergy in this vast parish of Hursley were able to do it. Butterfield had been working in Winchester for a very long time already. And this is one of the expressions. He worked in each of the Hursley churches, Sparsholt, Hursley itself, and Ampfield and Archerbourne. But in April of 1866, when Keble's body arrived on the train from Bournemouth, he was staying at Hursley Park with Sir William Heathcote, because they were doing this together. Which is not a collegiate institution, but I bring it up because of its extraordinary sense of scale and its incredible inventiveness. Starting in 1861, Heathcote and Keble and Lord Ashburton and William Butterfield began to develop a new county hospital. The Pavilion Hospital plan was already in place, so a hospital would spread out along narrow things like St. Augustine's College, with the beds coming off towards windows and air into light. But again, what he does, like all St. Margaret's, he stacks up essentially 3 pavilion hospitals, one on top of the other. He has a huge fight with Florence and Nightingale, who's advising them on placing the chapel up here. At first they refused to build one at all, and then he says, I want it as a landmark. I want people to see that health and godliness go together, and I want people to have access to it. So this is a fight that he wins. A fight that he loses with Florence is over these outside balconies, which she doesn't want him to have the patients wheeled out to outside balconies, because she feels that's too large a burden on the nursing staff. So I don't know whether out of contempt or just because it was there in the design, he still leaves the arches for it. And they never got on again. It was the last time they were friends. His other work in Winchester is very curious and interesting. There is a lot of it across Hospital, the old Bede House. But he started to work at Winchester College in the mid-1850s. And in 1858, he builds this very, very beautiful cloister in memory of the fallen in the Crimean War. And each of the angels on those columns represents, with a banner, is held with each of these words on: faith, virtue, knowledge, temperance, patience, and charity. These are the 7 biblical virtues by which character is built. And then, again opening in the same year as Keble College, the Mobley Library at Winchester, which is the first college library developed as a recreational and informative build knowledge on your own space. It has certain clear resemblances, although it's within the broad fabric of an older building, to what you do here, a place bathed with light, with comfort, and that knowledge is something to be pursued as pleasure. Just before the work on Keble College is his other great educational institution, which is Rugby School. Starting in 1866 and working with the remarkable Frederick Temple, he develops for the anniversary of the school something called the New Quad, which you see emerging here beside the 1820s to 40s buildings that the school then had on land that had not been occupied before by the school. And it is a building of extravagant complexity, which is not aesthetic. It is incredibly logical. It looks like an inventory of northern Italian architecture. It looks like a set of references, like an encyclopedia of architectural history. You're seeing the 1885 version here. He added a bit to the south in a form that was not in the original design. But what you actually got, I always wondered why here's his new building on a street corner in what is now a very, very busy town. I always wondered why he drew the adjacent building, because the plan doesn't show anything there. And what has happened here is he has taken some of the 1840s structure and changed it slightly on the outside, but inside, under the instigation of the masters of the school and Frederick Temple, he has established an experimental chemistry laboratory, an advanced laboratory, a hazardous laboratory for experiments with electricity and so on and so forth, a botanical museum and library, lecture rooms that are also serving as demonstration spaces, a drawing room up here, the largest room of the whole, in which great architects like Halsey, Ricardo and Blomfield were first taught to draw. Two music rooms here. There were two music instructors. There were three drawing masters. And then so each of the spaces developed, as you see in the sections, by the masters themselves for specialist education. This is absolutely remarkable. And Nature magazine in 1869, 1870, the world's most important scientific journal of the day, has two long articles with plans of this as the most important step in England. It's happened in Germany. The most important step in England in the advancement of scientific education. Rugby School, I'm an old rugbyer and you forgive some prejudice here, but Rugby School had, under Frederick Temple, established natural sciences, modern languages, English literature, modern history as fundamental parts of the curriculum. Butterfield didn't let them forget God in any of their exploration of the natural sciences, which certainly Frederick Temple, one of the authors of Essays and Reviews, was accused of. And he makes the new chapel, which he builds in 1870 and opens in 1872, a presence in every way. But you will see on the top layer of the new quadrangle on its interior court a wall of glass that could be by Mies van der Rohe or Walter Gropius. And when in 1854 Butterfield with John Duke Coleridge had written an essay, or what I might call a manifesto of architecture, they called it The Necessity of Modernism. We've just learned from the past for the last 10 years. Now let's move on. We've got our principles. We can move forward with some confidence. I'm going to move faster. There is the wonderful interior of the chapel, and then the orchestration of the close the open space of the school, and so that you get at Rugby always with the brooding of the rugby chapel, these sports facilities which were supposed to bring the community together and the teachers together with the boys in a social context, working together. The last two major buildings, apart from an observatory with a major telescope, are a reading room and art museum. And the idea of a school having an art museum was absolutely unique as well. And here you see that building 12 feet high from here to there, so that the walls could be hung, and a curator's house, and this again was a recreational facility. You make gentlemen, you build character through knowledge and through exploration of the world. And then the last one is the new big school, which is mostly basically for music, concerts. And it's described by one of the boys' magazines as the windows from Venice or walls from Siena and the whirligigs from God knows where. And the poet Rupert Brooke, when diagnosed with an eye disease, said, "I know where I got it." Moving very quickly to Oxford and then very briefly to Keble. This is Merton College, the Grove building as originally built, which was a startling and highly controversial step towards Keble. It's still basically a staircase building with 16 sets, but you see what a mess Merton was at the time that he added this building, and it actually was admired in many of the non-Oxford magazines and press. It was condemned roundly by the Oxford Times and the Oxford Architectural Society, of which he was a member. And here we are in December 1867. Butterfield was appointed architect at the first meeting outside Lambeth Palace on May 26, 1866. And a point to be made briefly about that is he was so well connected with all of these people. He'd been there when Keble's body arrived. He designed the graves for the Keble family. He did the memorials in all four Hursley churches. We don't think about him, one cannot think about him as the architect hired to do the work. He was a participant in the initiation of the project, as he was in so many other things that he did. There are two things I'd like to ask you about this. One is, do you recognize it? And what's different? The gatehouse a little, but what's the fundamental difference? The material. So Keble was designed in stone, and he produced these drawings for a meeting in December 67, in which these stone buildings be done. And then early in 1868, he was asked to see if he could revise the budget by building in brick. At the end of his life, he said to an old friend that he always regretted this decision. But one of the remarkable things to me is that he changes it very little when it moves to brick. But this is a drawing that to me is almost more important for how much of the design stays true. And when the foundation stone is laid in 1868, he presents the plan of the whole, and then very much the plan of the ultimate Keble is there. So I see Rugby School as a dispersed city in which people are brought together in a sense of community. Frederick Trample said it is the idea of common life on common ground. And I think that Keble is the idea of common life on common ground, of sharing meals, of not squirreling yourself away in your rooms and drinking beer with your friends over a mealtime, of working together in the library, of living with your tutors in the same quarters, and of this sense of a common life within an enclave. And at my most romantic, I think of Keble and Rugby as two versions of the ideal city. One is the ideal city spread around the landscape and bringing things together, and harmony comes from the places where you meet. And the other is you have an enclave, a precinct of divine beauty in which you build your character through walking through the buildings. And such as I have of good character, it's not much, comes an enormous amount from my walking through Rugby School and my living in the Grove building at Merton and having that experience. I'm going to close with some of this, and I've been trying to develop with the photographer for the book I'm working on, James Morris. If you think of the chapel as the cathedral of the city standing on its hill, if you think of the city as a place where corners and passages are more important than the whole, and where vistas of things coming together work the best, and of where the great spaces are those you move through and meet people in and experience the shift of light and other things. And where the division between private and community space is never absolute. So in the Wardens House, the first floor is develops from the entrance point, and from the beginning, Warden Talbot met his fellows every morning for breakfast. And there was a sense that this was a community space, and you'll see very clearly that the same motifs in the common spaces reoccur in the supposedly private ones, and this business of the leitmotif bringing everything together, this great Gesamtkunstwerk that is Keble. And there is the Warden's House with its missing bit, which is, this is the extension. This is would have been the great staircase that connected it to the last bit, which is that extension to the south in the quad, which I would encourage you to build. I had more, but I'll stop.